Today's gonna be a full cinematic breakdown of a gym commercial that I'm working on right now. We're gonna break down the gear that we use, the lighting that we use, we're gonna break down a couple shots, and even how I color graded this footage. So let's get after it. Now this is my first time shooting a fitness commercial. If you're new to this channel, you know that I work with a lot of fitness companies and do a lot of things from athleisure to working with supplement companies, and this is one of the looks that I use the most. I actually use cameras that have the ability to have great low light and using fast lenses. So I was actually using my FX6 as my main camera for my handheld shots and using the Sony FX30 as a gimbal camera to get a couple shots in as well where I needed them. In terms of the lenses that I actually ended up using, I use a 35mm G Master lens with my 50mm G Master as well. A lot of the main shots are on the 35mm, but I did use my 50mm to get some close-ups, some tight shots, and a little bit of details now and again to make sure that I was getting all the coverage that I needed. Now in terms of getting a more filmic or cinematic look as one would call it, using diffusion filters on your lenses is gonna be something that's gonna help you guys a lot. Now a lot of you guys use a Tiffin Black Pro Mist or using a Moment Cinebloom filter, but I'm actually going to use a 1/8 glimmer glass by Tiffin on the front of my lenses. I find that this gives me the halation that I'm looking for without being overbearing in terms of lifting up shadows and making things look a little bit too overdone. The glimmer glass is nice, it's subtle, it gives me that little bit of a lift and halation, but at the same time I don't sacrifice things like sharpness and quality at the same time. Now when you're going into a gym or a public place, you want to do a location scout, and one of the reasons why I want to do that is to find out what the lighting is like. Now a lot of places like gyms actually cater towards just making sure that the lights are on, they're bright, and people can see and don't trip over themselves, and they're not too concerned over the temperature of light or the quality of light or their CRI value or anything like that. And this gym is no different. When you walk in, there's some house lights, and it gives everything a little bit of a yellow tint, and a lot of gyms with fluorescent lights tend to do that. So what I actually do is I turn all the house lights off and I start to set up my own lighting. Now in the spot itself, there was a big window. We wanted to be able to control that in case the sun would go up and down, adjusting our exposure. So for our key light, we actually used the Nanlite Forza 300 on a 6x6 scrim with 3/4 diffusion on it. Now this was actually put in front of the window to help motivate the light. So even if the sun would go down or the lighting would change outside, we would keep things consistent during the shoot. Now we did have to act quick and we did have to move fast, so this light didn't move very much. And if I had a little bit more budget and a little bit more time, I would have a more complex lighting setup and adjust things a lot on the day. Now on top of that, the only other lighting types that I actually used were the Nanlite Pavo tubes. Now I have a bunch of the Nanlite Pavo Tube 30C version 2s, and I put those throughout the gym. I find these are really helpful because you could actually control them on your phone. You can control things like its color, its temperature, and its brightness, all by using an iOS device like your iPhone or your iPad. Now this came in clutch to make sure that my Pavo tubes weren't brighter than my key light and throwing off my image. And for this particular shoot, I actually only used it at daylight balance because a lot of the walls in the gym were blue, and I didn't want to offset that by creating different colors that might clash in the final footage. Now with the Pavo tubes and the Nanlite Forza 300, one thing I want to keep consistent is lighting for the space and not necessarily the face. Once you got your lighting down for your location, you can use other smaller fixtures to maneuver around with you in order to make things a little bit easier. Which brings me to my next light, which is going to be the backpack light. Now this is a technique that I stole from a Mark Bone video. Shout out to him for actually coming up with this, but I actually put the Falconize RTD, I put this light in a backpack by actually putting the control box with a V-mount battery in a backpack and attaching that light to a boom arm or just having somebody Hollywood it for me. Now if you're somebody that has a little bit less people or you're by yourself, you can get the same effect by actually putting a light on a C-stand with wheels and moving that around. But I actually wanted to make sure that I had a light that was able to move with me. Now what's the key to every cinematic image? It's not shooting at twice your shutter speed or using the smallest aperture, but it's gonna be haze. It's probably not actually haze either. But we did use a lot of haze on the shoot. Now my hazer actually broke down and I had to use some of the canned atmosphere aerosol cans in order to actually haze up the space for the shots that I wanted to get. Now surprisingly, for a 3-hour shoot, I only ended up using about 2.5 cans of haze to haze up an entire CrossFit gym. Now if you guys want to go pick up a couple cans of haze yourself, you can click the link down in the description down below. But these are things I keep in my bag at all times in case I ever need it, and a lot of times haze just makes things look that much better. So we did talk about using the Sony FX6 and the Sony FX30 on the shoot. Now my Sony FX6 was my main camera of choice because I do like shooting a lot of fitness and handheld, but that didn't mean we didn't get a couple shots on the FX30 using the Ronin RS2, a gimbal that I don't think I'm going to upgrade anytime from soon. But in terms of the camera settings that I did use on this camera, I shot a lot of things in 24 frames a second at 180 degree shutter, which basically means 1/48 or 1/50 shutter. My style a lot has changed in terms of the shots that I get, and I wanted to keep things looking a little bit more natural and not too surreal for this commercial, and I wanted to get things done quicker, and I was also working against the light. So using things like a higher shutter and bringing that exposure down means I had to do that much more work to end up having the lighting that I wanted to get. Now, in terms of my exposure, because we are working in a low light situation, I actually only used 800 ISO for this particular shoot. I posted a couple of frames up a couple days ago, and some people were asking me what ISO value that I actually ended up using on the FX6. And I use its low base ISO because once you're able to get your lighting dialed in, using 800 ISO and actually using Cine EI200 meant I'm gonna have really clean shadows on the day, but I'm still gonna be able to expose for my midtones and my highlights properly. Now, the Sony FX30 sat and lived on the gimbal with my 20mm lens on there as well. Now, this was a dedicated gimbal camera that I only got a couple of shots in there. However, they were the only shots that I did get in slow motion. I do like having a couple of these insert shots, but I don't make it my mainstay in terms of my footage, and the Sony FX3 in conjunction with the FX6 works really well as to be a dedicated gimbal camera while you do most of your heavy lifting with the Sony FX6. Now, it is pretty straightforward in terms of breaking down some of these shots because we're only in one location, but I am going to show you 3 shots that I like the most on this commercial set, and we're going to break down where the lighting is, and we're also going to get in some color grading after that. All right, so all the shots are actually shot in handheld, so there's not much to say about that, but this is how you can make one lighting setup work in 3 different scenarios for your commercial shoots. Now, the first one we do is we actually put all the lighting, the majority of it, at the back of the gym. As you can see, the Nanlite Forza 300 is on my back window shining through the 6x6 scrim, and it's set to an exposure that's high enough that if you're looking at it at a quick glance, you can't really tell that there's a big scrim that's in the way of the window. On top of that, we actually set up the Nanlite Pavo tubes not only to act as backlights and rim lights, but we're actually going to use a bunch of different setups with this exact same scenario with the Nanlite tubes and the Forza, so we don't have to move things around in order to get multiple scenes with this lighting setup. And then we use our backpack light, that falconized panel, in order to give us a key light, so at the same time it looks a little bit like the window light and the Nanlite Pavo tubes are being motivated by this falconized light. Which brings us to shot number 2. We've kind of made a little bit of a shape into here. We put our assault bike in the middle, but we're still a little bit of a distance away from the Nanlite Pavo tube, so they still act as rim lights, giving us a little bit of highlight on our subject. On top of that, this is exactly 90 degrees from the Forza 300, so we're actually getting a big key light that's lighting up our subject and giving a lot of level and giving a lot of depth and dimension. Now, we didn't put any lights on camera on the left side of the face because we wanted to go for that Rembrandt lighting. We still wanted that depth and dimension, so we actually put nothing on the side, and that's how you could really tell that these Nanlite Pavo tubes are a little bit actually behind instead of right beside. Now, shot number 3 is actually a good use of backlighting. Now, this actually is the beginning of the day. We didn't have a lot of things set up just yet, but you could still see that one little Nanlite Pavo tube adding a little bit of tone to the room so it doesn't look totally dark. But what we actually did is use that big window with the Nanlite Forza 300 on the scrim in order to give us a big bright backlight that you would use if you're using the sun outside. And the fact that the exposure is high enough coming out the Nanlite 400, it's really hard to tell the frame that's around it, and it really helps sell the look. Alright, so we're actually going to break down some of this grade. Now, this isn't going to be an in-depth tutorial. I'm just going to go through some of the nodes that I use in order to bring in this image in the order that I actually made those adjustments. Starting off with our color space transform. Now, we did shoot everything in S-Log3 and S-Gamut.Cine, so we ended up using the color space transform, which you can see right about here, in order to get the proper settings to bring it into a Rec. 709 space. Now, after that, I normally put on my creative LUT. Now, this is Terraform for my new pack. I mean, it's an old pack. You could get it for 10 bucks as I'm making new ones, but I end up putting the LUT on the other side of my color space transform, and then I make all my adjustments under the hood of Rec. 709 in order to really bring in this look. Starting off with using something like exposure. Now, my exposure I adjusted a little bit as I was going for a little bit more of a faded look, but eventually I want to try to bring in those black points in. So what I did was I brought the top ends of those lights down by actually going into my gain, bringing that down, bringing my lift up a little bit, just to put things as far in the middle as I possibly can without looking ridiculous. And that's pretty much how I'm going to start with my exposure. After that, I go into my white balance, which honestly, we didn't really do much or anything because the white balance was dialed in the way that I wanted to, but I keep that note there just in case. Next, we're going to contrast, and I kind of use contrast in 2 different ways. Now, one, I use a contrast to my primaries just to see if I can get a little bit more into the black point without going too high into my highlights. Now, I do play around with my pivot option and on my contrast to kind of see where things are sitting, but the biggest thing I want to do is try to keep this from actually going past that black line and clipping. Next, what I did was I actually turned on my saturation node. I actually brought the saturation down in this. The Rec 709, after the conversion and the LUT, came in a little bit hot, so I brought this back down because I still am going for a little bit of a muted, desaturated look with some defined black points, but I probably shouldn't have used a glimmer glass because it is lifting those shadows a bit, but it is overall a look that I really do enjoy. And then lastly, all I did was just turn on my skin tones. Now, if you see this after and this is before, it is a little bit on the greener side of things, so I wanted to bring some of that back in, and then I changed it to put some reds back in there, so the skin looks a lot more normal and how I actually want it to look for this final grade. Now, looking at this right away, there is a lot of exposure in this image, and a lot of it comes from the fact that the Forza 300 is shining right over here onto this side here, but then we don't have any lights on this side, which makes it very dark. So I want to try to adjust this in my exposure node, and this is how you're going to start to make tweaks as you copy and paste grades from one clip to the other. I'm going to take my lift down here as the shadows are lifted up quite a bit, and I'm going to start to move them down. Now I'm going to try to be really aware of this down over here. I don't want my whole clip to actually end up crushing. And that's going too far and it looks a little bit crushed. That's too high, it looks like I've done nothing. So I'm gonna try to park it right about at the side here. Now again, white balance, everything looks pretty good. I'm gonna go over my contrast and see if I can get a little bit more of that black point without making things a little bit crazy. And honestly, there's not a lot I can do here. I think I made this light a little bit too bright. And you know what, we're not perfect, so those are things that you learn along the way. My saturation node is going to stay pretty much the same, still going for that muted look, but that's what it looks like when we don't have any of the skin tone adjustments. Things look a little bit more on the green tinted side, so when you bring that back in, skin looks a little bit more like it should. And then obviously at the end, where we should actually start, is our color space transform, and then this is with the terraform LUT on, and this is without it. So this is with, this is without, with, without.
And that's it. That's a full cinematic breakdown of a recent fitness commercial that I was working on. It takes a village to raise a child, but it also takes a village for you to be able to get the commercials and get the films that you want to make the way that you want them to look. And a lot of this in the cinematic breakdown couldn't have been possible without having some extra hands on set to help out. That being said, if you guys do have any questions or any comments down below from the technical, how I set up type of shots, or even how I plan a shoot, leave a comment down below because we're going to be answering every single question that's on here, and I like hanging out with you guys in the comment section. That being said, I hope to see you guys in the next video. Peace.